If you were a social issue voter in the 80s, you're probably still a Republican voter today. If you were an economic Republican, you've gone to the Democrats. And kind of the same thing has happened in the Democratic Party as well. If you were a social Democrat, you've stayed with the Democrats. If you were an economic Democrat, used to be the unions, middle class, you're by and large going to the GOP now.
Welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Andrew O'Hare of Salon, and I am joined today by a face that may be familiar to you if you watched any of the House Select Committee on January 6th hearings, which seems like a long time ago now. This is former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Republican of Illinois, and the subject of a new film called The Last Republican. It's not fiction, it's a documentary. Whether or not you are actually the last Republican is something we can discuss. Adam, it's great to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
And it's one of the things that this movie addresses, that the director of the film, many of the people that watch it, probably many of the people watching this, may not agree with you on a lot of political questions, but as you observed in the film, you made a lot of new friends by standing up to Donald Trump and lost a lot of your old ones.
Yeah, that happens. And I mean, and one of the great things about it is, so the director is to the far left of me. I would consider myself kind of center right. But what we show in that is like you can be friends with somebody you disagree with. And one of the things I say is not necessarily, you don't need to be friends with an insurrectionist. There's a fine line here, but somebody that has a different view of government. Honestly, it makes life kind of entertaining if you can have those kind of spirited discussions. But yeah, I mean, the last, 4 or 5 years has been really marked with losing some family members, more extended family. My close family's been good. Losing certainly a lot of friends, people I fought with even in Iraq. And making some new friends too along the way.
I mean, it's obvious from the film that this has been a very, personally a difficult period for you. And I don't want to make the whole conversation about Adam Kinzinger's pain, but that is real in this movie. The movie's about you. It has to be difficult right now in a brand new way, given what happened about a month ago in this country.
It's very tough because I think like a lot of people was convinced that no way the country can do this again, right? Despite the polls, obviously the polls showed it close. I really believed that it was kind of undersampling Harris voters. So it's been pretty hard to watch the country do this again, to know what I know, frankly, what everybody knows about what happened on January 6th, and see by and large the country to make a decision that doesn't matter because we've been so driven by this fear and this division that somebody like Donald Trump puts out that it compelled a victory. And so, I have a lot of concern. I think I've pretty much shed all of my friends that were gonna let me go because of what I believed anyway. So there hasn't been any new broken relationships, but it's sad to see what the country's gonna go through for 4 years.
I mean, I have to assume that you could not have imagined this, like Trump coming back to power and this ridiculous string of appointments. I mean, I have to laugh at some of them. It's not actually funny, but do you have a little bit of that reaction? Kash Patel, for the love of God.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's fun. This part's funny. Right after January 6th, a guy named Fred Upton, congressman from Michigan, told me, he goes, Trump's gonna run again. I'm like, Fred, that's BS. He's not, come on, man. Let's be serious here. He goes, no, he is. So yes, he not only ran again, he won the Republican primary handily, and then he frickin' wins the presidency. So no, I never saw this coming. In fact, I assumed, like I think most Americans, that after the January 6th committee exposed what Donald Trump himself had a hand in, that the country would be like, we can't do that again, because democracy really is fragile. That's the thing that I try to remind people. But here we are. And it's been, I don't know, it's tough to watch.
Because you spent, you and the other members of that committee spent so much time exposing that everything that happened. Watching it again, I watched every minute of those committee hearings. It's my job. But watching it again from this distance, I felt like it was just as painful again the second time, partly because like a lot of other people, I kind of repressed how bad it was. Yeah. And it feels like the whole nation has repressed how bad it was at this point.
It does feel like it. And, look, when you look at the media environment, particularly the news environment, where half of the news tells the truth about what happened on January 6th. The other half is incentivized to suppress it. I mean, when I spoke to the Democratic National Convention, to give you an example, Fox News turned away from my speech, from Jeff Duncan's speech, from Olivia Troy's speech. Every Republican that spoke at the DNC, they turned away from. And so Yeah, it's tough to watch. It's tough to see what's going on, and to understand that America needs to be reminded of this. And hopefully that's one of the things that the film can do, is kind of bring back a little, even though it's not really super political, just bring back the reality of what happened. And every time I watch it, I'm kind of filled with, oh yeah, that's right. But I think on our consciousness, we suppressed it, and unfortunately that came through on the election results.
Yeah, I mean, I remembered it from the time, but seeing the sort of the big speech that you give in one of the later committee hearings, which definitely got you a moment, in the national spotlight. And it is this almost like operatic address to the nation about, what you feel our values are, and the importance of democracy and the way that transcends party politics. And I guess I'm compelled to ask the question, are you wrong? Was what you said wrong? Because it feels like that sometimes.
I don't think it was wrong. But I think the problem is we're a country that has suffered from a lack of leadership to remind people of the importance of democracy. I mean, this is one of the things I've come to really respect and realize, is that whoever's at the top of the nation, whoever's president, really does set the tone for the country. And we unfortunately have not had somebody remind us of the importance of democracy, of the ideals of democracy. So no, I don't think I was wrong, but I also think there's a lot of people that need to be reminded of it. Look, we can have disagreements, and again, disagreements on policy, if it's done right, can actually be fun, right? You can have differences over a beer. But what we can't have a difference on is the rules of the game. And when you threaten democracy, you threaten the rules of the game. If you're playing baseball, for instance, and you're playing at St. Louis, you're playing the Cubs, and you make the decision as the Cardinals, I'm just going to run to third base and then to home plate, the game falls into chaos. And that's what, screwing with democracy happens. Then the whole game falls to chaos.
Yeah, the question of whether we still believe in those institutions and the leadership it strikes me as very crucial. In that respect, I'm sure you have disagreements on policy and all that, but in that respect, was Joe Biden's presidency a failure?
No, I don't think so. I think he had a fairly successful presidency. I mean, there's a lot I disagree with him on, particularly how we left Afghanistan. Although,
I imagine,
although that I think largely still rests on Donald Trump for how he set it up. I think Joe Biden, as president, did what we generally expect of a president. He put forward some ideas, passed a lot of these ideas. I mean, infrastructure, which I voted for, the CHIPS Act, which I voted for, those were good things. But I think where he did fail was kind of, they hit him a little bit, first off.
Yeah.
Merrick Garland not going after criminally for a year and a half. Was a huge failure. And frankly, I think that's part of the reason where we're at today. So I think it was a successful presidency, but only history can judge that, because the question is, we're going to have 4 years of Trump. What comes after that? And in 10 years, I think we'll be able to make a better assessment.
Do you think that the way it played out with Merrick Garland and the DOJ, was that an abundance of caution to not want to be seen as partisan and political?
Yeah.
I mean, you would have seen the process almost from the inside.
Yeah, it was, look, when we did our first big hearing, so not the one with the police, but the first in the series over the summer, there was like kind of an oh crap moment in the DOJ, because we had so much information there that they realized there was crime, and we proved crime. And that's when the investigation started. So we were basically at the end of our investigation, and we had 10% of the tools that the DOJ has to get information. And so then they started their investigation. Had they actually started when we did, or they actually could have started before, it took us a while to get this committee up and running, they would have had all of the information that they have today, probably before we would even released our findings. Look, if you're going to say that nobody is above the law, you've got to follow that through and investigate. And unfortunately, he didn't. And again, he's probably a great guy. I'm sure he is. But I think history's going to judge that pretty poorly.
Yeah, and it strikes me that certain things were predictable about this, even from the outside, and you're closer, but not in the legal system. The idea that certain judges were going to stall the process, like Judge Cannon in Florida apparently did, and that there would be, unexpected setbacks and delays. That all comes with the territory, right? It seemed obvious to me that 2 years was not going to be enough time. And I don't know why they didn't understand that.
Yeah, I don't either. And I think, look, I mean, if you go back to without the delays being put in both of these cases, the classified documents case, which, by the way, they gave them almost a year to release classified documents, that case and the January 6th case would have been adjudicated by now. But again, you have to assume Donald Trump's whole strategy from day one was to stall and delay and hope that he would win. Well, he won. And unfortunately, these cases will now be dropped. Now, Jack Smith's going to release his findings, so maybe we'll get information, but this guy is now totally exempt from any criminal prosecution. And I worry not just about that, what message does that send to future presidents?
Because the statute of limitations is going to run out on these charges by the time he's eligible for prosecution.
They
again.
will, and also there will be nobody that thinks we should reach back that far to prosecute. And I wouldn't put it past Donald Trump at the end of his presidency to pardon himself for everything that he could potentially be prosecuted for.
He can't pardon himself on the state charges. There is that.
Right.
But you spent a lot of this movie talking about the Republican Party and wanting to save it clearly and wishing that the 10 of you in the House who voted to impeach could have formed a coalition and like a power block and essentially tried to take over the party. That didn't happen. That didn't work. We are where we are. A lot of the people who voted for Republicans this year seem to deeply mistrust all institutions,
right.
not just the democratic institutions, but law enforcement, everything else, which is, you and I are both old enough to remember when Republicans liked law enforcement.
Yep.
So
a whole 3 years ago or whatever. Right.
What does it mean to be a Republican right now, and what's your vision for a possible future?
Look, I think what it means now to be a Republican is just you're driven by anger. You're driven by division. I mean, if you look at the Republican Party and say, what are the unifying principles? Most people will draw back the old days of Ronald Reagan and say, oh, we're for smaller government, powerful military. But if you look at it, no, we're not.
Yeah.
No, the GOP isn't.
Yeah.
They're for spending even more than Joe Biden spent, by the way. They are for ceding Ukraine to Russia, which would be anathema to the Republican Party just a few years ago. So I think what they stand for is supporting culture war, rage, and one personality, and that's Donald Trump. Now, they'll never admit it, but that's the reality of it. Now, what's the future of the GOP? Can it be saved? I don't know. I don't think the GOP can be saved in the near term, but I don't think we should give up on it because the reality is this. There's probably still forever only going to be two major parties in this country, and the Republican Party will be one of them. So we can either write it off and lose elections with such consequences like we had, or we can continue to fight inside. It's why I still call myself a Republican, even though I haven't voted Republican in 4 years now, because I haven't changed. I will continue to fight for the soul of that. It may take 10 or 15 years, maybe 20, maybe never, but we have to fight for that.
How long is it until we start to see the current Republican Party begin to think about the immediate future? We all know what happens in the second term of a president. It's probably much higher than 50-50 that the Democrats will win the House in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And we know that once that happens in a president's second term, everybody's looking for the next guy and the exit doors. At what point does he really become a lame duck and a succession battle begins?
I think in a way today, he's already a lame duck. Obviously he's not going to come up again. You're going to have jockeying behind the scenes to be the next Donald Trump or the next iteration of whatever the GOP is. But there's also going to be something unique about him, which is he controls the base like no other president has. Ever. So
maybe Abraham Lincoln,
Yeah, maybe. Like you think about like George W. Bush, towards the end of his second term, Republicans were falling away. That won't happen with Trump because all those Republicans that should be falling away will still have to face re-election even though Donald Trump doesn't. So that's a concern.
What I observed at the Republican convention this year, and I've been to quite a few of them, was
sorry.
It's interesting. It is a little bit like visiting an alien
planet. Did you wear an ear
for me.
bandage?
I saw quite a few of those, but is a party that has deliberately severed itself from its history.
Yes.
I remember going to Republican conventions in the 90s when I was a fresh-faced young journalist and seeing old ladies who had like Alf Landon buttons, like people who went back to the 1930s and for Wendell Willkie, and of course, like Eisenhower was a huge hero. And not only is there none of that left at all, but you don't see you see nothing at all about George W. Bush and very little about Reagan.
Yeah.
It was like, and those are two-term Republican presidents, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And that's really, really weird to
It
have
is.
divorced yourself from that history so completely.
It is. And what's interesting is, so I get called a rhino. Rhino
Of course,
means Republican in name only. The reality is the entire Republican Party today is the rhino. It's the Republican in name only. They hold the title Republican. A lot of them still think they're holding a legacy, but that's exactly right. The things that Republicans should be most proud of, they run away from. Let's think about this. I mean, obviously this wasn't the case for a while, but we were the party that freed the slaves. We were the party that built the interstate system. We were the party that believed in federal infrastructure. We believed in a small government, but an important role for the federal government. We believed in strong national defense. None of that exists today in the GOP. What does exist is culture war. And yes, in the 80s, an unholy alliance was made between the Republican Party and kind of the Christian right to fight for, taking out abortion rights and other things. That unholy alliance overtook the GOP. And so, if you were a social issue voter in the 80s, you're probably still a Republican voter today. If you were an economic Republican, you've gone to the Democrats. And kind of the same thing has happened in the Democratic Party as well. If you were a social Democrat, you've stayed with the Democrats. If you were an economic Democrat, used to be the unions, middle class, you're by and large going to the GOP now.
Well, that was one of my questions. Like, what do you perceive now that the Harris campaign and the current Democrats did wrong? Because as you just observed, they didn't lure a heck of a lot of Republican voters over by campaigning with Liz Cheney. It sure doesn't look like they did. And they lost significant numbers of what used to be their core demographic. Mm-hmm. Definitely Latino voters, as we know, Asian American voters, and to some extent Black voters. And they cannot afford to lose those people and lose the unions or the white working class. Like, that's the prescription for death.
It is. So what I think happened, first off, I think a lot of Republicans did end up voting Democratic this time. The problem is a lot of Democrats voted Republican. Yeah. And so it kind of washes that out. This is what I think frankly happened. For the last 10 years, there's really two issues that doomed the Democrats in hindsight. One is, if you have a college degree, you're most likely to vote Democratic. If you don't, you're going to vote Republican. The other thing, if you're female, you're going to vote Democratic. If you're male, you're going to vote Republican, generally. So let's take the gender issue. For the last 15 years, anything masculine had been called toxic, right? Yeah. The term masculine, you had to stay away from it. We can't talk about masculinity.
In a certain American demographic, let's say, in the educated classes or something, right? That's what we're talking about. And salon readers, okay.
And what that created is a lot of animosity in young men.
Yeah.
Men under the age of 25 that are like, what is my role in this world? I feel this like energy that men feel, whatever, but I'm told that that's toxic. So Donald Trump comes along in that vacuum. And he presents real toxic masculinity, actual toxic masculinity. But in the absence of any masculinity, that draws young men to that. And this is where I think it's not necessarily a Democratic issue, it's frankly a male issue. We have to present to people a positive version of masculinity. And the other thing is, the Democrats have got to come up with an agenda for the working class again. And some of that are some of the social issues that drives them as well.
I mean, I'm not one of the people who's going to sit here and believe me, we have these people in our universe, and like Bernie Sanders would have won, damn it. Right. But to some extent, they need that energy, right? I'm sure you disagree with Bernie Sanders on a wide range of issues, but the energy and focus that he brought and the way that he was able to attract working class voters that the Democrats were otherwise losing, that's very important, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I'm not sure if Bernie Sanders' brand of politics could have gotten a majority of Americans.
Right.
But I think if you take his energy and his ability to talk, I mean, really, he's like Donald Trump, except he actually has a moral center. But I mean, he was speaking like that, just kind of like straight up to people. And so, take that energy of Bernie Sanders with kind of good, solid policy, and you can win elections forever.
Why didn't it happen that, the Republicans who for 5 seconds included Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, who knew that what had happened was terrible and knew who was responsible. What actually happened that made that energy completely dissipate?
Raw power. That's all it is. So with Mitch McConnell, he believed, I mean, if Mitch McConnell would have voted to remove Trump, you would have gotten enough Republican senators. He believed Trump was done, and he wanted to avoid that pain. The biggest sinner in this is Kevin McCarthy, because for 3 weeks between January 6th and when Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago, the Republican Party did not know what its future was. And I talk about this in the movie, which is this was the opportunity for those of us that voted to impeach to basically take over the party. And unfortunately, the other impeachers did not join me in that. But when he went to Mar-a-Lago, that changed everything. And he did it for one reason. He wanted to be speaker, and he knew he could not take on Donald Trump and win the speakership, so he chose to embrace him. Kevin McCarthy owns Trump as much as Trump owns Trump.
I agree with you, and I couldn't help the malicious thought that, did you find it satisfying in a certain dark way?
Yes, I know where you're going.
That McCarthy could not outrun the wackos in his own party. Like he couldn't go far enough for them.
It did, because he surrendered himself to them. And I knew when he was surrendering himself, I'm like, you're going to be speaker for 8 months. Great, congrats. You're in the history books, but that's it. Yeah. So I'll be honest, it was kind of a little bit of a Schadenfreude, we call that. Yep.
How well, tell our viewers, readers, what do you know about Mike Johnson? How well do you know that guy? Where is he going?
I didn't know him well in Congress. He was pretty new while I was in. I mean, he's
fresh face.
Yeah, he's
looks
risen
like he's
the ranks
26 years
quickly.
old. Yeah,
I know. Very obviously religiously conservative. He was actually one of the drivers to January 6th. So he and I got into some arguments over email about he was trying to get all of us to sign on to some lawsuit, amicus brief for Texas to try to throw out the election. And he came out of nowhere. Obviously, he's going to have a tough speakership this term because they're only going to have 1 or 2 vote majority. But he's been able to hold that together so far.
How bad do you think the second Trump term is going to get? Because I've heard everything from he can't really do that much, there's institutions in place to get ready for, the Fourth Reich.
Yeah, I mean, we're not at the Fourth Reich yet, but I do believe that it's going to be a mess. And my hope is, this is the best case scenario, is it's just a government that's incompetent, right? I really am concerned about Ukraine, for instance. What does this mean for Ukraine? But the worst thing is if it's not an incompetent government, if it's really a move by him and his people to seize power. Look, I think there'll be an election in 4 years. I don't think we have to worry about that. But the damage that's going to be done to the guardrails and institution could be long lasting. That's what I'm concerned about more than anything. And I'm also concerned when you cross these red lines of things that you never thought politicians would do, and they do it, now other politicians cross those red lines, and eventually you cross too many.
Do you feel that way about? I understand on a human level why Joe Biden pardoned his son. I don't feel the necessity to judge that, but in a political sense, is that an example of surrendering to the crossing the red line problem?
I think a little bit. So if I was president and that was my son and they had come after him because he was my son, I would have pardoned him too. So it's understandable. The problem is when you sit and you do that and you say, well, Donald Trump does it 10 times worse, which he does, by the way, let's be clear. But that doesn't give us an excuse then to turn around and do that. That said, the pardon power is a legal power of the presidency. And I've said, even when Donald Trump inevitably pardons all the January 6ers, I'm like, he never hid that. He said he was going to do that. So when he does it, I'm going to say, I don't like it. But he was clear and America voted for it.
I will conclude by admitting that certainly I'm sure we could find lots of areas of disagreement, but and look, you called Steve Pink, the director of this film,
basically a communist.
Well, I'm going to tell you something. By the way, my mother was literally a communist. I'm not exaggerating. My mother was a member of the 1940s Communist Party USA.
Nice.
But that isn't actually.
She would be so disappointed in you now as just a far lefty.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But I do think the thing that is actually inspiring about this movie, just to butter you up for a second, is that you clearly stand on morals, ethics, and principles. You and I might not share all sorts of political opinions. That might be true for all kinds of people watching this, but you decided you were going to stand for what you knew was right, and you probably knew that it was likely to mean the end of your political career. Yep. Yes,
I did. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine that you didn't see that coming.
Yep, I did.
And I guess the question is, since you and Congresswoman Cheney were the only other people paid the price, but you were the ones who visibly stood up. What is the role of morality in politics now? When you see somebody doing what you know, what a lot of them did, what J.D. Vance has done to completely, he literally called Trump a Nazi, and now he's going to be Trump's vice president. So is there still room in both parties for morality and for morals and principles and ethics?
I think on the Republican side, there is no morality right now. Is there room for it? Yes. I think there is still morality in the Democratic Party. You know, one of the things that I have appreciated over the last 4 years is, we talked at the beginning, my new alliance with kind of liberals, right? And what I call this is an alliance to defend democracy. Look, when you're in a trench and an enemy's 5 meters away or 50 meters away, you're going to focus on that 5 meter enemy, and that 5 meters is the threat to democracy. You go to Ukraine in a trench, and you're going to see people on the left and the right that are fighting together to defend their country, and that's where we're at now. And so I think there is still morality left in the Democratic Party, and I think there has to be morality. Otherwise, politics just becomes an exercise of power, which it generally is, but I still think it's driven by good people going in it for the right reason.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger, I think 6 terms in the House, more than 20 years between the Air Force and the Air National Guard, is that right?
Yep.
And one of 2 Republicans to serve on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack, and you paid the price. And now the subject of a film made by the guy who made Hot Tub Time Machine, Steve Pink, The Last Republican, which people can see that now, right?
Yeah, well, it's going to be premiering here in New York and then other cities going forward in the future.
Fantastic. Adam, thank you so much.
You bet.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. It's good.
Thank you for watching Salon Talks. If you had a good time, why not subscribe right over here so you can get more conversations with your favorite artists, actors, directors, writers, comedians, musicians, politicians, everybody you love, and I love too. And while you're here, why not watch another video right now?